Let's be brutally honest right now. That's a big question.
I'm looking for someone who doesn't want to go to base camp, but they want to go to the very top.
Whether it's here, India, New York.
Civilization was born at happy hour.
That's what wins. That's what stands out. That's what people are interested in. That's what I want to know. The Hospopreneurs Podcast with James Henderson. Hello and welcome to the Hospopreneurs Podcast. Mike Brabant, CEO of Australian independent coffee company Single O, joins me on the program today. The company was called Single O long before single origin really became a thing, so they've always seemed to be a step ahead. We talk about that focus on innovation, its link with sustainability, and the brand's expansion into Japan, along with the economic and cultural differences between each market. Our supporting brand Plant Array are currently hosting Tropical Month to foster and celebrate a global hospitality community. Hello and welcome to the show, Mike.
Thanks, James. Thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for joining the Hospopreneurs Podcast. We met a little while ago, didn't line up a time, and now we've eventually found something. Since then, you've had your 20th birthday with Single O as well. I'm really excited to get into the interview, hear about your story, your journey in business, how the birthday was, and what's been happening in the business since. You're doing some pretty amazing things. So thank you for sitting down with me today.
Cheers, James. Appreciate it.
As you know, the first question that I like to ask on the program is a crazy hospitality story or exceptional hospitality experience. I'd love to know what you've brought to the program today.
So how I ended up in coffee was through bartending and that side of the world. So my first job actually in hospitality was for a business called 42 Below in New Zealand. And I had a friend at university and she reached out to me just as I was finishing and said, I think you'll like this company. They need someone to be an event coordinator. And so my job was basically organising the awesomest coffee competition in the world. It was called the Cocktail World Cup. The wild part about this was basically a cocktail event like no other. We'd bring them down to Queenstown in New Zealand, and it wasn't enough just to make them mix up the best cocktail. We overlaid the extreme activities in Queenstown, like bungee jumping. They had to make one. So they had to make a cosmopolitan while they were bungee jumping. So that was my entrance to hospitality, was running this event where we got 40 bartenders from around the world. They arrived in Queenstown in New Zealand. We drive them straight to the 43-metre bungee jump in New Zealand. In Queenstown, they'd have to mix a cosmopolitan as they bungee jumped. Half of them didn't even want to jump off, let alone mix a cocktail. And then throughout the week, we had all kinds of other crazy activities. That was like the foundation of, I guess, my hospitality career. I'd worked at McDonald's and done that when I was young. I'd worked in bars, and then I got this job. And I guess this exposed me to some of the best hospitality people in the world. And it's funny, I was thinking back to who I was looking after. I was a 24, 23-year-old kid, didn't have much of an idea about anything. And I was the event organizer, but some of the people that were there, I remember I was looking after Miffy Rigby. She was one of the journalists. Then there was Jason Williams, Chris Highstead from Black Pearl, Hayden Lambert, I think has Above Board in Melbourne. So all these hospitality professionals that were at the tip of their game in this cocktail competition that I was looking after. I guess I was sort of the event coordinator and just helping them to have a good time. And we would have competitions all day, then we would party all night. You know, we're running on 2-3 hours sleep. But I remember every morning at 5:30, we had to be there for the briefing. It was really professionally run. But I think foundationally, I learned, about exceptional customer service. I learned about like passion and craft and what these guys were doing. I learned about professionalism. So I remember telling my friends and my family, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm just down in Queenstown. We're just throwing a few bartenders off the bungee jump and they're mixing a cocktail. They're like, what? That was my fear.
Yeah, so straight away, you've come into the industry and started learning from top bartenders. You came in through bartending, met all these amazing professionals. After that, did it give you some false expectations on what hospitality is as well? Or coming from McDonald's before then, was that something that you're like, okay, no, this hospitality is not normally like this?
I think they just showed me what great looks like. Because whilst it was fun and spirited and we had all this stuff, these guys were like, some of those names I heard you sort of nod, like they've gone on to do the best bars in Australia, or they run the best hospitality groups in Australia, or they ran good food. Like, I didn't realize at that time, it's only on reflection and looking up some of the names and connecting with them that that brand at the time was at the tip of it was trying to take on Pernod across the world. And this was really on the edge. So you were getting the best bartenders in the world. So if anything, it just set the standard for what good looks like. And actually that team in New Zealand, the way they ran events and the hospitality, I think I've never been able to unsee or unlearn that. If anything, it's just showed me like where the bar was from a very early age. And I've always striving in parts, whether it's in sporting career or to emulate that to a degree, because I think it was actually foundational for me on reflection. And it led on to lots of other funny things as well.
On that note of what led on to, I know that the story from there gets pretty exciting for you too. So talk me through what happened with that brand and what that led you on to be able to do.
They were sort of purchased by Bacardi, and I was tossing up what story to tell you, but Bacardi took over 42 Below, and we got to do lots of fun things. Like we took a 60-seater coach, like a bus, and we turned it into a mobile cocktail lounge. And I remember one night, the head of New Zealand rang me up and said, I've just got a call from Fergie and the Black Eyed Peas. They want you to make cocktails for them for the night. Can you mobilise it, sort it out? They want us to pick them up in 4 hours. They're obviously doing a tour. They'd heard about this sort of mobile cocktail lounge experience we'd created. So I remember calling out the bus company. I was, again, probably 25, 26. By that time, I'd done a few events and stuff, and I was running this bus mobile cocktail lounge and rang them up. I was like, look, this is what's happening. And they kind of got the vodka professor, who was our sort of head of training, a guy, Jacob, and we stocked up the bus. And then, at 6 or 7 p.m., I can't remember, or maybe it was like 11 or 12 at night. That's right. It was after their concert. We picked them up and they cruised around for 2 hours, and we made them mojitos and cocktails and so forth, and they partied in the bus. That was pretty wild.
That's very cool. A lot of hospos will have stories like this where part of their career will pass some famous people along the way. And we've had all sorts of stories on that on the program. Exciting to hear one of yours, because then the brand, like you worked with the brand, and then that kind of allowed you to do quite big things in your career. What I'm trying to do here is understand where your career went from there to then lead you into coffee now, and then Single O's now 20 years old. So tell me more about how you then got to work in coffee.
So from Bacardi and 42 Below, I guess that was like foundational around, 42 Below as a brand was spirited and it was fun. And then Bacardi, I got to see some of, I guess, how a bigger business works. And then from there, my next role was actually in Amsterdam, partner at the time. We went there together. I was actually transitioned there into sports. I was actually working for ASICS, or some people know Onitsuka Tiger, but it's all one. So my first role there was I was actually organising all the marathons across Europe. So hospitality in the sense, in that I was going to Paris, they'd have 30,000 runners, and I was organising sort of the running expo with the French team. And then we'd sort of have, 20,000 people through our booth, and we'd be promoting ASICS. That's where I started. And then from there moved into, brand and I guess more leading running category roles, where I was, I guess, leading the running category for ASICS in Europe, and then was the category lead for ASICS, which involved a stint in Japan as well, where I moved to Kobe in Japan for 6 months and helped work with the global marketing team over there. Essentially, marketing and sales role, driving the growth of ASICS across the world, trying to get more people running and healthy, which is the other passion of mine. And from there, my wife's Dutch, met her in Amsterdam. She wanted to come back to Australia. I'm actually Kiwi, obviously, but we wanted to come to the sun. Came back here and was looking at all types of roles and things, and found this brand that felt very much like what I'd experienced in my first role when I was 24. As I said, it's kind of foundational, and had a similar feeling, like obsession about product, obviously a bit irreverent, did things their own way, and met Dion and Emma, who founded Single O in 2003 in a tiny little corner of Reservoir Street where we still are today, just a little bit bigger. I remember the interview was 6 or 7 hours. We talked about everything, and we just found that we had the same ideals, mostly around business. And I started working there 7 years ago, initially as a head of marketing. Moved into a general manager and then CEO role in the previous year. So people often ask me sort of what's the link to coffee? Always been a big coffee drinker throughout my life, always been passionate about craft and quality through my bartending and through where I'd worked. So that had always been something I was interested in. And I think the way I kind of reflect on it is that, I learned like this irreverent, fun-spirited craft at 42 Below. And then at ASICS, it was about product obsession, Japanese business. So I really learned about detail, and I call it healthy obsessions because at ASICS, I got into ultra trail running. So I got really into running in the mountains for long distances with the ASICS trail team that I used to work with. But I really learned about quality, product quality, passion, and hospitality too, right? So, we hosted this thing called ASICS Beat the Sun in the Mountains in Chamonix, which was basically a race where you had 15 hours and 41 minutes from sunrise to sunset to circumnavigate Mount Blanc, which is a mountain that is France, Switzerland, and Italy straddle. We brought teams from all around the world together to take on this challenge. It was called ASICS Beat the Sun or Outrun the Sun. So I think I've always thrived in those hospitality environments where I'm bringing people together to take on challenges, to do things a little bit differently. And that was the attraction for Single O when I came here. I didn't want to go into a typical business. I'd kind of come from a small business and sort of a hospitality background into big businesses. Learned a lot, built a lot of skills, but ultimately wanted to get back to a business that wanted to do things differently, where I could make change, where I had alignment on the values with the owners and the team, and thought that I could have some fun along the way. And that's how I ended up at Single O. And then coffee, the quality piece was important to me because, I believe in quality of product and passion and craft. That's always excited me to see people that have dedicated their lives to maybe coffee roasting or sourcing or brewing, baristas, roasters, sourcers, and the knowledge that you can learn from those people and that they apply to their discipline and their craft is pretty phenomenal. So I just felt like coming back to where I started, actually. That's a long way of saying.
You say coming back to where you started, but quite clearly there's a lot that you learned along the way that then led you back there. Mike, you have obviously had quite a varied career in commercial roles, working in this marketing capacity and then more into sort of sales marketing and then GM and CEO. I'm interested to know what you are learning right now. What is it that you're focused on, that you're pushing forward with or innovating with yourself? Maybe it's that commercial end. Maybe it's the product. Maybe you're learning about something a bit more personal. I try to keep this question quite broad to look at each guest uniquely and individually. So I'd love to know where you take this. What are you learning about or exploring at the moment?
I think what we're learning about or exploring at the moment is a lot about the Japanese market. As a business, Single O has been in Japan for 10 years. Our general manager there, Yama's been with Single O for 15 years. But he started as a dishwasher in our Surrey Hills store 15 years ago on his own overseas experience. And he fell in love with coffee. He had an espresso at Single Origin back then, which is the original name, Single Origin Roasters. And he fell in love with espresso and coffee. From there, he became a barista, then a roaster, and then a Q grader. And then he took Single O to Japan.
From what I understand, Q graders are essentially like a sommelier of coffee.
Exactly, yeah.
Right? I think that's the best way to describe it for those who don't know what Q graders are.
Yeah, they're professionals basically skilled in sensory evaluation of green coffee, and they are employed throughout the industry. There's a few thousand of them around the world from the Coffee Quality Institute, and it sort of gives everyone, I guess, a simple way to understand it as a shared understanding and language to rate quality as well as environment and source around coffee. So it's a shared language, essentially.
Thanks for that, Mike. So you're learning about Japan, learning about the Japanese market, and you've lived there too.
Yeah.
So I'm particularly interested in what it is that makes you say you're learning about that market. Given that you've been there, has it changed a lot, or is there always more to learn?
Always more to learn in Japan. I think it's been a specialty market that we entered, as I said, 10 years ago with Yama and his wife who run that. And I think what we've learned over time and what we're learning about is the importance of building up trust in that market. So we've grown really sustainably over the last 10 years. But what we're learning about now is, I guess, we have a new roastery that we're opening in April this year. So we're sort of quadrupling capacity in Japan. And we're also opening 2 more retail stores, one in West Tokyo and one in sort of central Tokyo. So we're learning a lot about, I guess, how to scale up our retail business in Japan. We're learning a lot about, what a great retail experience looks like in Japan. Because Japan, for everyone out there who has traveled there, and I know a lot of Australians go there for the food, and the coffee scene is amazing. The level's really high there. So we're learning a lot about what we need to do as well as what's important to the Japanese market. And it probably has shifted in 10 years. I think they've always had a really strong sense of specialty coffee in Japan. And people often ask me, does Japan have a coffee market like Australia? And the answer is not simple. The answer is they've always had a really strong specialty coffee market. And that's sort of intertwined now with those who've gone over there and they've formed, I guess, a mix of what's come out of Australia and their own market, which is, it's very filter driven, for instance. So versus Australia is very espresso driven.
I might get in trouble for saying this, but I've always found that Australia and Japan are the 2 countries that I always see coffee being done incredibly well from. So elsewhere, like in the UK, I couldn't find a good cafe that wasn't owned by a Japanese person or an Australian. I could not find one in the 2 weeks I was there, but I'm interested in your perspective on that even, because I kind of want to broaden it to coffee more generally, coffee culture. You're talking about Japan. Maybe we'll start to talk a bit about Australia and what's changed in your time in the industry too. So just talk me through that a little more generally.
I think Australian coffee culture, well, not the product itself, but the culture of Australian coffee culture and how we do it has become an export itself. So you mentioned places like the UK. I lived in Amsterdam for a long time. It's very common to see a place called Little Collins in the heart and somewhere in Amsterdam. And of course, it would be sort of Aussie inspired. So I think Australia is playing its part in making its mark on the world. And I think for Single O, exporting that Australian specialty experience to new markets, that's kind of how we ended up in Japan. It is very interesting. I think, I don't know, is there a world where the default coffee culture around the world looks like sort of Australian brunch culture? Does it grow so much more in the future that people don't think about Starbucks and American culture anymore? They think about sort of specialty as coffee around the world even more so than they do now. That's a question we sort of ask ourselves. So it's definitely an interesting market out there, I think.
There are a lot of roads that we could take after that, your answer to that question there. And I'm really interested in some of the threads we could take. What I would like to ask you about, though, is more specific to the Australian market and the Surrey Hills store. I think it's the Surrey Hills store. You've got the batch brew taps. Is that right? Or is it a different store that I'm thinking of?
Yeah, it's the batch. That's the free pour batch on tap machine. That's correct.
I'd never seen anything like that. It blew my mind when I saw that, walked up to the counter and I ordered a batch brew and poured it myself. I'd not seen anything like that before. I'm very interested in that system itself. You and I have talked about this system, not on a recording. We talked about it on a phone call, but I'd love to ask you here during this call about that, what that is, why you've done that. Talk me through batch brew in the Australian market, filter coffee in the Australian market, and what we've seen, because I've certainly seen it grow a lot more in recent years. What sort of makeup are you seeing that batch brew or filter coffee has as a percentage of sales these days?
I guess going back to the start, black coffee consumption as a whole, as a category, was probably like 2%. And now black coffee would be around 25%, 25 to 30% in our Surrey Hills cafe. So that's over the last 20 years. So that just shows you how much black coffee has grown. And that's kind of funny if you think about single origin roasters. We started, but it became sort of a category name, single origins. Now it's synonymous across the industry to serve origins that are traced back to where they're from a single farm or producer. But to your question on the batch taps, or the actual name for them is the free pour batch on tap, and it's invented by a company, co-created with a company called Six Simple Machines that are based out of Botany, just around the corner from us, our roastery. And the insight was, Emma, our owner, was traveling through America and just looking at all the batch coffee and the diner coffee and how much it was sold. And I think we were at the time rebuilding our Surrey Hills store back in 2019. And whenever we do something at Single O, we kind of talk about nudging coffee forward. So for producers and planet and people. So that's around, how can we, if I put that in simple terms, it's like, how can we disrupt things to change things to make them better? And I guess after that trip, Em and I were sitting there staring at the batch coffee pots that you get. And more often than not, right, as baristas and coffee companies, we're serving single origins. So we're serving a higher priced product at a premium price. But the delivery of it is does have those sort of American diner vibes, those camping vibes. So we were wondering why we put this time and care into the product and source, and we just make it in a Fetco brewer and put it in an air pot and sort of just serve it out like that, like an American diner. So I guess our hypothesis was like, can we, by building a delivery system that sort of feels more like craft beer and how craft beer had communicated, I guess, nuances of taste and craft visually through the taps, could we work maybe with this company, Six Simple Machines, who Single O had co-created the juggler with sort of years ago, which is saving milk bottles from the waste stream. So there was a relationship there, and we met with them and they came up with a prototype, which we launched when our cafe launched, which was in 2019. So batch sales, to answer your question, now sit around 15 to 17% of our sales, and they were probably around 2% at the time. And why we love it is it puts black coffee and origins front and center. So it makes the consumer think about, what are they drinking? What's the nuance of it? Where's it from? Because it forces a conversation. As well as that, we made it self-serve and turned it around towards the customer at our Surrey Hills site, at least. So you can actually avoid the espresso line, which obviously in the morning at 8 to 10 a.m. is packed, right? So we kind of solved a couple of things, which was like putting origins front and center. So putting black and trying to get people to really, we've been doing this for 20 years, but we felt like we're never there. So this was like a concept that we launched that was trying to put origins front and center and get the consumer to think about what they were drinking and ask and engage with the barista. And I remember when we were launching it, we had this prototype. It was 2 days before the opening the stores. James, we'd never got a consumer off the street to come and see if it worked. And I remember Emma and I were down at Surrey Hills and Reservoir Street. We're pulling in consumers with coffee mugs and saying, hey, can we just borrow you for 1 minute? And can you come and just try and see if you know how this thing works? And it was hilarious. Like people were like pulling it like beer taps because they'd never seen anything like that in coffee. So they're linking it to the beer category. So they were trying to be the bartender. And we were like, oh God, is this going to work? Anyway, we launched it. And Six Simple Machines have since improved the product. It's now got digital screens, it's got self-pay, and now it's at some of our wholesale partners and other coffee brands across Australia. That's the perfect example of Single O. That epitomizes Single O, that whole process of looking at the coffee industry and going, how could we take something and do it better, but for the purpose of either the product or the customer, whether it's speeding up wait times or getting people to try more black coffee, and it's worked. That's one we're really proud of. And then in Japan, the market's 50% filter. So we put 6 taps in our Hamacho location and 40% of the coffee in Japan in that one store is served through those taps. It's kind of crazy, right? Like we're so used to seeing the espresso machine, but here's the delivery system that's changing the way we're serving coffee to people and speeding up wait times and getting people drinking more black coffee. So it couldn't be more Single O from my perspective.
It's very cool. I think it's very, very cool and very exciting. And that actually makes me think about how people use the Australian market generally as well. And you've tested this concept here in Surrey Hills and now been able to apply that in a context that is actually really going to provide a commercial benefit to the business as well. So interesting to hear how you've applied that sort of innovation globally too, which is really, really cool. The next question that I have for you, Mike, today, I'd like to ask you a bit more about how those innovative processes within Single O and your sort of mindset, how you've been able to then apply them into NPD or new product development, for those who aren't familiar with the acronym, into you've got a new RTD product too, or ready to drink product. So I'd love to hear a bit more about that. Talk me through your creative process in developing that, maybe the commercial decision to develop a new RTD product and what it is and what you're doing with it now?
That's a great segue, James, because actually the RTD product started from our taps. So to explain, I guess, our innovation process, we at Single O, at least, it's always about coming from like an insight that's really true to the product or our customers. It's very rare, and Single O operates a little bit differently, where we don't necessarily just look at a big category and go, oh, hey, that's making heaps of growth and money. We're going to go and make a product for that. I've never seen in Single O in our innovation process that a product has worked from that. It's always been born out of a really true insight, either from, as I said, product or a customer or a collaboration with somebody. And the iced oat latte was no different. Obviously, there's lots of cans out there, so it's not necessarily that it's something new, but for us, it actually came from our iced oat product on our taps at Surrey Hills, which we just saw were gaining like crazy popularity. And when we launched actually the Freeport taps in Newstead in Brisbane, where we launched a cafe last year in 23, iced oat product outsells flat whites and lattes in Queensland at that store. So it's around 30 to 40% of sales. So we just saw this amazing demand for this iced oat product. And look, we're cafe people. We've been supporting wholesale businesses and doing retail stores for our last 20 years. We're not canned coffee people, but we thought we could have a crack at it. So we basically took the recipe from Surrey Hills that we knew people loved, and then we tried to put that into a can. So that was how that sort of process started. So I think before we even get into the creative process, which I'll talk about in a second, but we always need to start from a truth or something insightful that's going to be meaningful to who we serve as customers, rather than just jumping on the latest trend or fad in the industry. And that's why we only just launched one product, because we're like, we really like this and our customers like it. So we're just going to can it and see how it goes. So we did 10,000 cans initially and they sold out in a couple of months. So we had to do more. So it was a pilot iced oat latte. And the fun thing about that was, I guess maybe to your question on creative process, I guess Single O, we're always just trying to do things a little bit differently to everybody else. And it's really easy to say those words. And I think a lot of people talk about doing things differently. But I think we try and do that throughout the whole process. So we actually put a QR code on the back of the iced pilot oat latte can. And then we've got like 3 or 4, it's like a live test. So we're selling it, but we've got about 500 data points from customers who are talking through, giving us feedback on the product. So we launched it as a pilot with our customers and said, look, hey, we're not sure if it's perfect. We think it's pretty damn good. You guys tell us what else you want. So what we're doing at the moment is like collating all that data and feedback. And probably in spring, summer, we'll launch kind of the final product design and everything. And so in terms of creative process, like bringing your customers along, so starting with a really clear insight, making sure that it feels like Single O. So not necessarily following what everybody else is doing, but just finding our unique point of view. That's really important. And then listening to your customers along the journey and then executing it in a fun way. And by doing this sort of pilot test, that kind of became our marketing campaign. That's become our data reasons to talk to people about the product. So they're kind of helping us inform the NPD while we're doing it. We've got a genuine reason to involve them in what we're doing. And so it's a great value exchange with your customers. So that's an example of the RTD product. So it's been successful. We'll keep building it. And you know, links back to Japan, that market's huge. Like look at the success of some of the products here in Australia. But we wanted to do a really good, great tasting only, because that's what we sell in as a default in our stores. So that's kind of an explanation on that process.
It's interesting hearing you say how different even the Queensland market can be to down in the southern states, because sometimes people, I think, overlook that. They think, oh yeah, coffee is coffee. Obviously, no one listening to this episode is going to be thinking that, but some people out there do think that. And so they're thinking, oh, you know, coffee in Brisbane, everyone wants the same thing to Sydney or Melbourne. But that's quite clearly not the case from what you've just described with the store in Brisbane, seeing that sort of data. So interesting hearing you make those comments. I'm going to go a slightly different direction for the last couple of questions in the episode today. This is a question that I'm asking on a video series that we're running called Bite Size. I've found it quite interesting. Different guests will say very different things. So what's something specific that is incredibly important to you that your customers aren't likely to recognize or know about or possibly even understand or appreciate?
That's just a bloody good question. Are you brand or personal brand?
Let's go brand. It could be something that you think personally is important that applies in the brand or applies in business or something more specific to work.
Probably something that our customers don't know is why we have a split bar in our retail environment. So it's something sometimes people ask us about, but when we designed the taps and the espresso bar, and it's something we've had for a long time, we always designed it with a gap in between. And the reason for that is so that person serving the coffee can not stand behind, so there's not a physical barrier, but that they can actually stand through the gap and then if needed, sort of walk out and serve the coffee. So it's really small twists of, I guess, service, but what it does is just it removes the barrier between you and the customer, and it's not something we talk about or promote, but it's something that customers would feel. So it makes the service feel personal. It makes the service feel connected to the person who's asking for your coffee every day. So whenever we're designing a new cart or a new store, we're always trying to put that sort of split in between the POS and where the espresso machine and the batch taps. We've kind of got this free pour taps on the left and espresso machine on the right and cut in the middle. And it's kind of become part of our sort of brand ID for retail store unintentionally. That's similar to that creative process I was talking about. It's born out of a customer insight, which is like customers don't want barriers, so don't make them. Take away the barriers, make them feel welcome. Yeah, a small little D, and I don't think many people would know that. I reckon our hospo crew and customers would probably recognize it, but I don't think a lot of people would know why we do that.
It's a very good answer. It's a very interesting answer to that particular question as well, and shows further that depth of insight you have into your customer and really into the human condition and what customers really want. I think people really want that. In my experience, certainly, I feel like removing that barrier is something that's quite powerful that might seem small, but does have that impact that you've described. So interesting to hear you say that, because I hadn't thought about that until you said it now, but it makes complete sense to do that. So yeah, really cool to hear.
It kind of just builds on, how good you guys feel if the barista says your name or pre-orders your coffee, which of course most of us do, right? It's like, it's John, it's oat flat white, no sugar, right? Like there's people and before they've even come in, you've brewed the coffee. You've made the coffee. And when John walks up, you've already given it to him and gone, hey, here you go. So it's an extension of that. But yeah, we get obsessed with thinking about how our design impacts the design and flow and operations impacts how the customer feels the experience is, not just how the person, I guess, at the POS talks to them or speaks to them.
Mike, I've got two last questions for you today. The penultimate question is, what are you experiencing friction with currently? It's a very broad question, deliberately broad. I'd love to know where you're experiencing friction currently.
Yeah, I think, friction at the moment for us is around, the livelihood of coffee supply and production. So we launched something called No Death to Coffee, which was a platform in 2021. But behind that platform is the why. So there's this amazing organization called World Coffee Research. So their mission is to, I guess, increase the supply of quality coffee and improve the livelihood of families who produce it. That's kind of their stated mission on their website. But basically, a couple of the key facts is that climate change is impacting land suitability for coffee production, as well as there being an innovation gap in terms of funding in coffee agriculture across the world, which means we're getting less diversity in single origins and origin varieties across the world, which means they're more susceptible to climate. So there's a lot of friction there because that's everything that we do. That's our whole world. Without coffee producers, we won't have an industry. We don't have anything of what we have. So by mobilizing greater investment into coffee agriculture and R&D, and to give you numbers, I think the gap's about 458 million that they say that we need to fill. So we're a supporter, and there's around 180 businesses around the world that support World Coffee Research, and we support the investment into coffee agriculture innovation to mitigate the effects of climate change and make sure that coffee can exist for all of us to enjoy. And most importantly, that producers can improve their livelihoods and continue to do what they're very good at. That's the area where there's the most friction at the moment because, that's why we called it No Death to Coffee, because we wanted to give it a sort of a strong feeling because it's a serious threat to our industry.
Can you tell me how that works?
For us, I guess it's not a movement, but it's a platform for us to, sometimes it's products. So in 2021, we brought in some climate-resistant coffee varieties, which we then did an educational session with the local industry. And then we also ran that product through our blends as a trial. So that was just to try and show that there's climate-resistant varieties that exist that will mitigate some of these risks that we're seeing in the coffee industry. But it also includes a focus on things like circularity. So we've got a first of its kind partnership with Reground and Vic. So Reground obviously been in Vic for a long time, and they collect coffee grounds from customers. And the insight there is actually when we did our carbon tracking, which is pretty normal. There's obviously scope 3 emissions and the disposal of your grounds through your customers, right? So if we supply wholesale kilos to a cafe and they dispose of that and it's not composted correctly or disposed correctly, that has an impact. So we set out to work out what that impact was, which is not normal in a carbon assessment. So we had to kind of design our own way to measure that. And we found that was like about 20% of our overall emissions, taking some assumptions on sort of average disposal rates through our customers. So we sat there looking at it going, wow, like the actual disposal through our customers, if that's not done properly, then that's having a massive impact because the grounds are sitting in landfill and they're off-gassing and causing methane in the atmosphere. So that's, I guess, another example of going into the little insight. And then from there, Reground, they collect grounds through the customers. So what we do in Victoria is we offer part of our package with cafes that we supply is that Reground service is paid for by Single O, and Reground will pick up their grounds. They give them bins and they can dispose of their coffee grounds in. So that's our idea of circular coffee with Reground and Single O, trying to take full responsibility from source. So how we source, what we pay, how we bring it here, how we offset what we do, how we produce it in the most sustainable way, through to even going to our customers and picking up their coffee grounds and making sure those get to community gardens and stuff around Victoria. So it's only in Victoria at the moment, but we're excited to think about where that could go in the future. So No Death to Coffee could be around climate-resistant varieties that WCR had bought. It could be around source. It could be around, recovery of grounds and carbon. But it's our way of saying that we want to play our role in making sure that coffee survives and that we can all enjoy it for hundreds more years to come.
I think on that note, Mike, I'll ask you the final question of the show. Thank you for sharing some insights there around the sustainability initiatives in your business too. I think that's certainly an angle that we didn't look at too much during the episode itself. We focused a lot more on innovation and those customer insights and that commercial end rather than the product side and looking at sustainability. So thanks for squeezing that in there, because I definitely wanted to ask you some questions about that today. But the last one that I have for you is the same question I ask on every episode, and that is, who would you like to hear on the show?
I think you'd have a great conversation with Nina Larson from Reground. I think she's built a great business and as a social enterprise in the hospitality, working really close with hospitality. She's at a cross-section of sustainability and hospitality that I think is really interesting. And she's got a lot of challenges and they've had a lot of amazing wins. So I think she'd be great to chat to.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me on the show, Mike. It's been great to chat with you, to catch up, hear more about your story. I've certainly learned a lot from you today. So thank you for joining me.
Thanks, James. Appreciate it. It was great to chat.
This program was produced by H Media. We'll see you soon.